All right, welcome to the Explainer. Today, we're diving into something that is, honestly, pretty mind-blowing. We're looking at a groundbreaking concept from independent researcher Levent Bulut called narrative engineering. And look, you might want to just forget everything your high school English teacher taught you about writing, because today, we are completely flipping the script and looking at the actual objective physics of storytelling.
So think about this for a second. Why do some stories just absolutely grip you, keep you right on the edge of your seat, while reading, say, an AI-generated story just feels totally flat and lifeless? Now, traditional writing advice always hammers home this idea of readability and smooth flow. But here's the crazy part. Bulut's research actually suggests that smooth, effortless reading, that might literally be a recipe for the most boring story ever written. And we're going to look at exactly why that is. Here's our roadmap for this explainer. We're going to redefine friction in storytelling, look at the three regimes of cognitive load, solve what's called the exposition paradox, dive into narrative entropy and pacing, and finally, unpack exactly why AI writing feels so generic.
So let's kick things off with that first point, redefining friction through what we're calling the Bulut Doctrine.
What exactly do we mean by information friction, or IF for short? Well, we aren't talking about tossing in $50 words or super tangled grammar. Information friction is actually a type of mechanical resistance. It's literally the cognitive effort your brain has to expend to decode information that the author deliberately hid or encoded. Basically, instead of spoon-feeding you the details on the surface, the text forces your biological operating system to do some heavy lifting. It forces you into active inferential reconstruction. And this quote really nails why that friction is just absolutely crucial. Bulut points out that when you drop friction down to zero, when you just state the facts directly, the text becomes totally frictionless. It just slides right across your mind like an ice skate on a frozen pond. You aren't solving puzzles, you aren't piecing together clues, and because of that, it leaves zero cognitive residue behind. It essentially creates a dead narrative.
All right, moving on to our next big idea, the three regimes of cognitive load. Kind of a Goldilocks principle for reading. Bulut's framework breaks down how our brains handle this resistance into three distinct levels: low friction, optimal friction, and chaotic friction. Let's see how each one actually feels to the reader.
First up, low friction. This is when IF drops to basically zero. Imagine a text that just lays all the emotions bare right on the page. Something like, "He was terrified of the dark." Your brain does zero work to figure that out, right? Because it's so incredibly easy, your brain just defaults into energy-saving mode, and suddenly you're totally checked out. The narrative just decays into pure boredom. But then we hit optimal friction. This is absolutely where the magic happens. Instead of just telling you a character feels claustrophobic, the text hides that emotional label completely and replaces it with physical parameters. Bulut calls this objective projection. So imagine reading about a room where the ambient temp is a stifling 28.4 degrees Celsius, the ceiling drops down to 1.65 meters, and there's this relentless 40 hertz hum in the background. Now your mind is forced to synthesize those physical cues to internally build that feeling of claustrophobia yourself. Your cognitive load is high, your brain is firing on all cylinders, and your focus locks in perfectly.
Of course, you can totally overdo it. That brings us to chaotic friction. This happens when the text is so incredibly fragmented or so much data is left unstated that the reader's brain literally short-circuits. It overloads. You lose what Bulut terms narrative gravity. Without an anchor to ground the story, your brain basically throws its hands up in the air, gets super frustrated, and you just abandon the text entirely.
So, how do we use this? Let's look at solving the exposition paradox by creating active puzzles.
The real takeaway here is that exposition itself isn't actually the bad guy. It's the friction level that's the problem. Just look at this comparison. Over on the zero friction side, you've got your classic info dump. It reads like an encyclopedia, right? Takes no brain power to process, and it's incredibly dull. But on the high friction side, if you take that exact same backstory and encode it into physical residues, stuff like material degradation, thermal signatures, physical stains, the reader instantly turns into a detective. You're transforming a passive description into a high-load, super engaging puzzle.
Okay, let's step into the thermodynamics of this whole thing with narrative entropy and story pacing. Now seriously, don't panic when you see this equation. You definitely don't need a math degree for this. This represents narrative entropy, or SN. All you really need to know is that narrative entropy is just the buildup of narrative heat over time, and it's driven by our information friction, IF, multiplied by causal branching. Essentially, friction acts like a thermodynamic pump running right through the heart of the story. So how does this pump actually affect a story's pace? Well, when friction is low, you read really fast. But because there's no cognitive resistance, absolutely zero narrative heat builds up. That means when you finally reach the climax, there's no emotional payoff. It's a total dud. But if you use deliberate pacing with high friction, you force the reader to slow down. They have to pause, decode subtext, synthesize clues. That friction builds massive potential energy. It cranks up the thermodynamic pressure so that when the tension finally breaks, you get this massive, powerful emotional hit.
Which brings us to our final and maybe most fascinating point: why AI writing always ends up feeling so painfully generic.
The empirical data from Bulut's research is just wild. Look at this benchmark comparing a human rater against 5 major language models. The test was to identify high-friction inferential rules, basically scenes where abstract emotions are hidden inside physical details. Out of 100 scenes, the human accurately spotted 9 instances, but the AI models, they were all over the map. They guessed 0, 1, 40, 72, and 78 instances. When you ask an AI to find explicit, zero-friction rules, it's flawless. But the absolute second you introduce subtext or cognitive resistance, these models are completely blind. Which brings us to this mind-boggling number: a kappa reliability score of virtually 0.00. I mean, think about that for a second. We're talking about machines with billions, sometimes trillions of parameters, and when it comes to deciphering narrative heat and subtext, they are performing at pure chance. They are literally just guessing. And the root cause of this massive failure is what Bulut calls summarization bias. See, language models operate entirely on statistical probabilities. Their whole job is just predicting the most likely next word, right? So by design, they inherently strip away all those beautiful high-friction inferential layers. They take complex, deeply encoded text and just flatten it into an explicit surface-level summary. Because AI optimizes for probability, it's always going to tell rather than show. And that is exactly why machine prose feels so lifeless. It literally erases the exact friction our biological operating systems crave.
So I want to leave you with this one big thought to take away from this explainer today. If artificial intelligence mathematically defaults to frictionless summaries and explicitly telling us everything on the surface, how will human writers leverage that incredible power of cognitive resistance and information friction to not just survive but actually thrive in the age of machines? Because as it turns out, the very friction that makes reading a bit of a struggle is the exact same resistance required to make us feel human. Really something to think about. Thanks for joining me today.